Okay, very good. A big welcome to everybody to the Aviation UK Aviation Fuels Committee meeting. It should have been held in March, and we postponed it to October. It seemed in March a long time in the future, but in pandemic terms, it's not. And here we are doing a virtual meeting. But it's going to be a great meeting. Tina Gleaves and her team in the MoD, and Francesca Ferrari and her team in the EI have put together a great program. And as you can see from the list, we've got some of the big names in the technical world of aviation fuel, the real movers and shakers. And so we've got a great program. A couple of bits and pieces. First of all, can all people who are just participants, as it were, keep their microphones muted and their videos switched off? That makes life a lot easier for everybody. If so that just keeps the whole thing a bit simpler. So microphones muted and video camera off. Okay, so that's one big thing. And the other thing is to make it a really good meeting. I think it's a real shame that we're not in London and face to face, because they're good fun, as people know. But we can make it a good meeting, in particular by having a lot of interaction, which means questions. And so please make sure that you ask questions. It's in some ways it's easier in the virtual context. So and there you can see the little icon that you need to click. I'll be monitoring those, and I will choose a selection depending on what comes up to ask the presenter. The Q&A is directly after the presenter has finished their presentation. So it's that's the time to do it. We're not coming back to each presentation after that. I think that's about it. Keep your cameras off and keep muted. That's the classic thing. I think the best bet now is to head on with the meeting. And well, I probably ought to have just. I'm going to introduce Jamie Miller in a moment, but just to introduce me. I mean, there's probably people who don't know me, but I normally chair the face-to-face meeting in London. My name's Mike Farmery, and in this context, I'm working with the EI to chair the meeting. So that's me, and the next one up is Group Captain Jamie Miller, who is in a sense the boss of this whole enterprise that looks after fuels in the MoD. And there's been a lot of changes. It's always changing, I guess, in the world of defence. And it's great to have Jamie, who has been in this role or connected with the Fuels Committee in a previous lifetime. So it's great to have Jamie along to present to us at the beginning. So over to you, Jamie.
Thanks very much, Mike. Yeah, welcome to one and all, and very glad you could all make it. I say over the airwaves, as it were. And I say I'm looking forward to hopefully next year when we actually can physically get together. Fingers crossed and touch wood. I'm literally going to do a few minutes only. And I thought I'd try and choose a few very quick topics that might be of interest outside of the Ministry of Defence, as it were. And the two things I'll quickly talk about is our new global bulk fuel service, i.e. our new fuels contract around the world that comes into play later this year. And a very quick piece on how Defence is looking to transform how it runs its fuel end to end. And I've got a slide to show that, so not many slides. So I purposely use this picture because many of you will remember we used to use Maersk since actually the days of the Falklands War. Maersk were always our operator of our main fuel tanker that delivered, picked up and delivered fuel to many of our overseas bases and the oil fuel depots, etc. But looking for better value for money, we actually downsized the vessels and plumped for 2 vessels instead of 1, the Clyde Fisher and the Raleigh Fisher. And we also use these vessels in a very different way. And under the new bulk fuel service, we actually can decide whether or not we're going to collect the fuel ourselves or actually have it delivered on our behalf. And that will very much depend on where these ships are in the world, because we also third-party hire them out to move other people's stock around. So we're trying to keep them employed full time, not only just for the Ministry of Defence, but therefore making it cheaper for us. Next slide, please. So this is a depiction of what we call end-to-end, or the defence fuels enterprise. From the left, obviously, the deliveries, taking all the way to the right to actually getting into whatever. I noticed somebody put a rocket on there for me. I don't think we're quite there yet, but space is on its way to the right-hand side. The new contract, as I say, is for aviation fuel, marine fuel, F-76, marine aviation, 44, and ground fuel. And it's been approved for a 12-year period. So that means that we don't have to go back for approval to change this contract over the next 12 years, which is a big move forward for the Ministry of Defence in the sense of the length of a contract for this sort of nature of commodity. So we have obviously a lot of the major suppliers are on the contract, and as I said, we will put a bid out or a request out for fuel, and we generally get 2 prices, one a delivery price and one a collect price. And then again, depending, as I say, on where our own ships are, we'll make that decision as to which of the 2 we will use. Generally, obviously the cheapest bid. But as I say, the key behind all of that was to make the hopefully the shipping less/neutral cost to the Ministry of Defence. And keeping in mind that what we're in a way terming the defence fuels, effectively the DFE, Defence Fuels Enterprise, as in that left to right. If we switch to the next slide, many of you will remember the Defence Fuels Group and its disbandment around 2011-12. And on from that, we had the Defence Food and Fuel Services, of which I was a part as well many years ago. And then the realisation that really didn't work in the sense of having a centralised place for fuels policy governance adherence. So the Defence Strategic Fuels Authority was reborn in about 2016. But on from that, we've realised that actually the DSFA really doesn't envelop everything that is that defence fuels enterprise. And if you take that across the top, this is an illustrative slide, across the top of all the elements that come into that enterprise, you can see on that second row down, the DSFA, we cover quite a few of them, but we don't cover procurement, and other elements within defence also cover parts that we also cover. So it's quite complicated and quite complex to get one view of fuel in the MoD, and luckily that's been realised, and we're moving towards trying to move potentially, and I say potentially, towards a defence fuels organisation, which will bring all of those boxes together into one organisation, similar to the Defence Fuels Group, but different. If it happens, the 2 differences will be, or the big differences will be, one, we'll be working for MoD Centre. We will not be part of Defence Equipment and Support, so we'll have the authority to direct. And secondly, as you can see on the step 1, step 2 on the left-hand side, the idea will be to start bringing within that organisation, and this is the big change, infrastructure. So for the first time, we would have one organisation that looks after everything end to end, because as many know, for the Ministry of Defence UK, that the frontline commands, the Army, Navy and Air Force, own at the moment and maintain through Defence Infrastructure Organisation their own infrastructure. So it's very stovepiped. it's very hard to get a strategic view because they own their own money. So this organisation would be a move towards that. And then the ultimate, which has been bandied around, but maybe many years away, is moving towards a full defence fuels agency. But as I say, I think that is a stretch target, the small steps first. And I just wanted to share that with you because that really is dominating a lot of what's happening in town when it comes to the defence fuels elements over the next year or so. And add on to that, the defence's move to the NZ50 targets and the government push for a green agenda. And I would say the two biggest things on the plate at the moment are this move to a potential defence fuels organisation and implementing a green agenda across defence. And obviously we have a large part to play in that. Next slide. I think that was my 3 slides. There we go. Q&A. So a very quick canter, and I just wanted to give you a quick overview just of where we're going. And hopefully next year when we get together, I'll actually be able to probably give you a better presentation and a little longer of actually the decision that has been made on where we're moving that, so I can actually give you the timelines as well. So on that note, I'm going to stop, noting my time is up. Are there any quick questions?
Okay. Well, Jamie, I see that there are none at the moment, and I think that's, in a sense, probably sort of quite good in a way, because we need to crack on. But thanks very much. I mean, it's great to have the overview, which in a way we don't get to hear of at the working level. So that's really really interesting. There's a lot going on in the background. But we'll wait until next March for an update. We're moving on, as people can see from the agenda, into a section which really is about the nitty-gritty of specifications. And the first person up is Tina Gleaves, who's the technical manager of the fuels group. And over to you, Tina.
Hey, thank you, Mike. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the AFC. It's a shame we can't do face-to-face, but there we go. Thank you. Next slide, please, Francesca. Right, our aim for the Destin 9191 are continuation of our harmonisation effort with Astm D3241. That's very important to us, and we are striving to get that as close as possible. The effort remains maintaining both the interests of MoD and commercial with a fit-for-purpose specification. And our biggest achievement this year has been the clearance of alternative fuels in accordance with the Astm D7566. This has been an achievement over the last 3 years to get this in place, but we've done it. Next slide, please, Francesca. Right, the current status is issue 12 was published internally 14th of September and externally 18th of September, and this includes a 3-month implementation period. It's available on the DSTAN website, which you need to go through the Defence Gateway to get, but I know they've been having issues and people haven't been able to get hold of it, but if you have problems, just email me and I'll quite happily send you a copy. Next slide, please. Right, so as I've already mentioned, our biggest achievement is the clearance of alternative fuel blends. And so that's necessitated the removal of Annex B1, which restricted the supply to MoD. And in line with this achievement, the global bulk fuel supply contract is in progress at the moment. It's to be awarded this month. Notice of award was issued 7th of October. There's a 10-day standstill period. So the award contract will be made on the 19th to the 21st of October, and this is subject to internal approvals. Next slide, please. The particle counting limits have been added to table 1, and this has been added as an alternative method to gravimetric, so either can be done. Next slide, please. In conjunction with the particle counting limits, we've removed IP564 ACM particle counting method, and that was due to the suspension of the method by the EI. There is a task with the Equipment Manufacturing Industry experts to ensure that the modification fully meets the requirements of the method. So potentially that can be reinstated in issue 13. Next slide, please. To do with particle counting, we've inserted a guidance note for test results that exceed the limits and for the unsatisfactory results in the presence of water. We've also inserted this note into Annex E, Table 5, Note 1. Next slide, please. Going on to a different subject apart from particle counting, the Astm D3241 aromatic dye issue. So Table 1, Note 5 has been amended to read that batch numbers greater than 983 are suitable for use and yields comparable results with batches prior to 975. Next slide, please. The other minor amendments are Annex A 2.6 antioxidants, so the reporting requirements have been simplified. Annex B 4.1 co-processing, minor rewording to align with Astm D1655. Annex C 4.1 FAME carryover statement, minor rewording. Next statement, please. Flashpoint Astm D56. This is the Flashpoint method with the bias. So Annex E Table 5. Due to the joint Astm study ILS 2019_MMS_1. Due to the outcome of that and the study position statements, the bias note has been removed. Next slide, please. So Annex F, additional information on fuel properties. So F 1.2, this has been enhanced to acknowledge that fuel storing distribution can unintentionally accumulate elevated levels of particulate. Therefore, additional handling procedures such as extended settling and filtration will be required prior to the point of delivery to the aircraft. Next slide, please. Annex F, which is F.4 sable color. There's been a minor change in that to read F4.2 changes in sable color amended to reduction in color in both the test and the chart on that section. Next slide, please. So looking ahead to draft issue 13 proposals, there's conductivity SDA has been raised. Is it safe to or reasonable to reduce the minimum requirement down to 25? Thermal stability automatic tubulators, should there be a referee method? And there's a lot of activity on this at the moment with ASTM and the task force. So we're all waiting for the outcome of that. Water separation test methods, there are 2 new ones which are up for consideration for inclusion in 13. And that is ASTM D7224 MCell and ASTM D8073 WSI. We've also been in conversation with the manufacturer of Tollard 351 lubricity additive. That's no longer supported by them, and so they've registered it to become obsolete. Next slide, please. So we're intent welcome questions, comments for amendments for issue 13. So if you've got any, please feel free to submit them to me and I can take them through Exco. Next slide, please. So in the next AFC conference, we were hoping it's going to be face-to-face. It's looking dubious at the moment, but we can hope. But it'll be 16th to 17th of March 2021. It will be in London, the hotel venue to be confirmed. Details and registration will be published by DSTAN and the Energy Institute, so look out for that. Next slide, please. That's the end of my discussion, so I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tina. Really good summary. And as you can see, I think the MoD is getting much better at getting these new editions of the spec out on a regular basis and updating to keep current. Obviously keen to keep harmonizing with ASTM and keep the 2 specs aligned where possible. But there's one question, Tina, from Joanna Baldry, who is asking about what mechanism, how do you keep alerted to new specs being released? How do you keep on the inside of that?
Does Joanna mean herself or people like herself rather than me?
Well, I think herself, I imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's well, the DEF stands are if you've got an account, you should get alerted if you've registered an interest in a specification. You will get alerted when there's a review going on and when there's a new one published.
Right. So key thing is to register.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks very much for that. I see no more questions, and we're bang on time. So if there's no more questions, I think we'll move on. Thank you very much, Tina. A great summary. And now we're looking at the other side of the Atlantic, and we've got a legend in his own lifetime, George Wilson, to give us an update on ASTM. Over to you, George.
Good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, team. Today, since the last time they have little discussion on other topics, and then wrap up about what we're going to do for our meetings this fall. So next slide, please. We've added the allowance for co-processing of Fischer-Tropsch feedstocks. Once again, just like the esters or fatty acid feedstocks, this probably won't accrue towards aviation fuel sustainability goals, but there's a need to, the refiners in the U.S. want to be able to get into the business of not buying fame, replacing it with something they make money on instead. And the talk is always like, well, we do this or we won't make jet fuel, so we have to kind of stay ahead of that. We've had a discussion on the downstream of water separation characteristics. That's with the two methods that Tina mentioned, the 7224 and the 8073. It's in the non-mandatory information. Table 1 still only keeps D3948 in it as for water separation because it's a matter of initial purity of the jet fuel. We've added 8267, the UV-Vis GC method for measuring aromatics percentage of table 1. D1319 remains the referee, and there is the 20A version of 1319 is available now that includes the acknowledgement that the new dye is suitable. We've revised the scope statement regarding military use. We had our statement before was a little bit too stringent. There's a general acknowledgement that the military may have some special needs, but they have their own specifications should they need to go off a little direction than us. But in general, they want to save the money by using the Jet A in the US. Next slide, please. Francesca, next slide, please. Oh, no, I'm sorry, go back. I was looking at my page, sorry. I've got one to my side so I can see from my right eye because I'm right-eyed. We've revised the Flashpoint footnote a little bit. It's not quite as dramatic as we wanted to, but we've got it. We've added the 7236 Flashpoint method to table 1. D56 remains the referee. We've added the Aquarius additive to table 2. Now this is important to note, this is an on-demand additive and its use must be specifically allowed in the aircraft documents. And we've added D8148 Haze Clarity Index to Appendix X1 as non-mandatory information as a kind of way to semi-automate the analysis of haze and fuel and storage. Now the next slide, please. Thank you, Francis. Other things that are going on, of course, Section 2 of the gasoline diesel reciprocating engines continues working on unleaded gasoline standards. I think probably progress has been delayed a little bit because of the aviation recession this year, but I know they keep working on it. Thermal stability and combustion characteristics, there's continued progress on updating D3241. Probably the biggest, most dramatic change is that gear pump JFTOTs are no longer allowed in the standard, either in 3241 and by extension, they're not allowed in 1655 either. Coordinated effort with EI will result in revised IP 323, and you can talk to Gary Ricard about how that's going to come around. Additives electric characteristics, there's continued work on revising D4054 to make it clear about how the process works. In section 5 on fuel cleanliness, concerted industry effort, we were able to get D5452 revised and keep it from falling off the edge of the earth at the end of the next month, at the end of the year. The final draft is in draft right now, and we expect it to be published shortly as a 5452-20. There's an ILS and planning stages for both D5452 and D2276. It will be conducted. Southwest Research Institute has volunteered to do the study here. And like was for the testing that tested the two filters, we'll be using our API, our EI 1581 test equipment to generate standards. We found that works very effectively. And then section 6, alternative aviation fuels, Mark's going to be talking next, give you probably a better update of what's going on than I could. Next slide, please. All right, the D2 meetings. Next slide. Francesca. There we go. The fall 2020 meetings are going to be online via WebEx. The schedule is listed there. It's going to happen over 2 weeks. We're going to do we have an executive meeting on the 7th, gasoline and spark compression emissions on the 8th, 4s on the 9th, D5 and combustion character thermal properties. 3 is on Friday the 10th. We'll come back on Monday and 5 on fuel cleanliness, 6 on emerging fuels on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday it'll be the jet fuel specifications. Each of these is kind of timed to appear in the same time frame that we're using right now. That seems to work real well. If nobody's too inconvenienced by the time we have the meetings. Not all of them are at that time frame, but most of them are. As always, ASTM meetings are open attendance. Lisa will send out a notice every day that the meeting is going to start to ASTM subcommittee members. We are happy to have you forward your login information to other people who want to attend and see what's going on. Hopefully we'll be able to meet in person in Kansas City, but we can't promise it. So don't know yet. It's kind of up in the air right now. So that's it for me.
Okay, George, that's great. Thank you very much. Really great run through of a lot of stuff that's going on. Now, there's in terms of the questions, there's quite a few come in, and in fact, one of the things we just as a thing to be aware of, and we've got a couple of minutes, so we'll cover as many as we can.
Okay.
What we're doing is just make sure you can put your questions in as early as possible if you can, because it's pretty difficult to manage it right at the end. I missed a couple off. One was put to Tina, but I can probably answer it. It's about the MoD clearance for synthetics. And she asked, does that support the SEPS approval? Well, it does, in the sense that it means that the UK is not the blocker, but there's another air force in Europe which hasn't opened its doors. So NATO itself at the moment is still saying no synthetics into SEPS. And then there's a couple of other questions which are a little bit in the detail, but they're going to be logged, so we can hold on to those and give you a written reply. There's one question here, George, which you could probably answer. Is there any activity to increase the amount of biofeedstock in co-processing above 5%?
No, there's not. And
Right.
I think you need to talk to the people involved with it. It's my understanding, and you might talk to Alistair Clark, would be a good source for that, is that once you get above 5%, there's a real issue with catalysts and dealing with the water that comes out of stripping the material. So there are catalyst limitations in that. But that may be improving. Of course, catalysts get better all the time, so that may not always be the case. But right now, there's no intention to increase those.
Right.
Yes, Mike, Alistair here.
Okay.
Very quickly on this, what George has summarised is exactly correct. The industry developed co-processing on the basis of a limited approval because of the catalyst. The research reports tested the fuel up to 10%, so double the approval concentration. So any further work would have to create a new research report and a higher concentration for OEM review and the wider industry.
Right. Okay, that's great, Alistair. Thanks for jumping in there. Really useful. We've got a question from Tammy Ali about Sabolt colour, and that's the one is mentioning that one is a manual and one's an automated, but they're both allowed in the spec with no preference expressed. Has anybody got a view on clarifying, or whether it's necessary to clarify a difference between those two methods? George, do you have a feel?
I have no particular input in it, because remember, it's not a specification for us.
Yeah.
It's just,
That's right.
Yeah, Mike, it's Kevin here, Kevin Bauer from ABP. I would say, I mean, historically, we've never had that differentiation between the two methods, even with the previous requirements. I don't think the automatic method is set up to give the same result as the manual Sabolt colour. So I don't think there's any clarification required, but we can just look at it and just see if there's any wording. I mean, I'm currently looking at including some statements in D1655 on Sabolt colour. So as I look into that, I'll look at if there's any additional wording required for 91091 as well. Yeah.
Great, thanks a lot, Kevin. A question in for probably for Tina from Roberto Rodrigo. Really, is the particle counting method going to replace the gravimetric method at some point in the future, and do you have any idea of date for that?
Hi, yes, it's at some point, and we're probably looking about 5 years' time. Not necessary for it to replace, but for it to become the referee method. I know that MoD rely on the millipore gravimetric method to some extent, so there would need to be a big investment on particle counters for that to go through. Right. Okay. Super. Thank you very much. And there's another one here which I think is a little bit technical, but it might just require an email reply. But it's about release certificates in the industry being a challenge due to the confusion in the current wording, and it says it does not need to duplicate existing information, but should be part of the consignment notes. And that's really saying, you know, does a cargo with a release certificate issued by a supplier mean a cargo is non-DEFSTAN compliant? So it's one of those sort of tricky detail questions about bits of paperwork, but I don't know if you've got a view, Tina. No, it's a tricky question. Sorry, Mike. I dropped out the microphone for a moment. All right. Well, okay. I missed half that question, so I'm not able to answer. If we can go back to that one later. Yeah, I see if we get time, but otherwise, I think it's probably just best to follow it up with an email. Okay. Good. Well, we're doing pretty well, everybody. That's great work. Thank you very much. Good questions. What we're going to do now is move on to the sustainability and alternative fuels bit, and we have another legend in his own lifetime. We've got Mark Rumerson from the FAA, and he's going to give us a good action-packed 10 minutes on where we are with sustainable aviation fuel. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning. Hopefully I'll get through this in a reasonable amount of time. For some reason, the animation always seems to take longer than I anticipate. But I'm going to give an overview of what we're doing relative to alternative jet fuels and ASTM. I'm going to give an overview of the qualification process, followed by talking about a couple D4054 process improvement initiatives, the clearinghouse, and that's the icon that's going to go with the clearinghouse, and keep your eye on that and remember that. The Fast Track Annex with its own icon. And then talk about alternative jet fuel pre-screening, which is something new. And finally, talking about the National Jet Fuel Combustion Program, integration into D4054. And then I'm going to provide a status of the pathways that are in process and those that have been approved. So this is a one-chart overview of the whole process we undertake through ASTM to approve for use alternative jet fuels in basically virtually all aircraft. It's based on the fact that, again, virtually all aircraft are required under airworthiness regulations to establish an operating limitation for jet fuel or for aviation fuel. And virtually all aircraft define Jet A and Jet A1 as the fuel they need to use. Typically, those are defined in terms of specifications, ASTM D1655 or DEFSTAN 91091. And at ASTM, we developed a guide or a practice, D4054, to basically compare a candidate alternative jet fuel with conventional jet fuel made from petroleum. And if the result of this comparison is that the new alternative jet fuel has the same performance and properties as conventional jet fuel, we balloted at ASTM and we added to our drop-in fuel spec, which is D7566. Each of the alternative jet fuels is added as an annex. That's the way we've been doing it. The reason for that is they all have to be blended with some percentage of alternative jet fuel, between 50 and 90%, to have a complete, what we'd call sustainable aviation fuel. So it's not 100% sustainable, it would be some percentage sustainable. And so it's only a drop-in fuel after blending. That's an important point. So the final step is that because all these fuels that we've added to D7566 are drop-in fuels, they are essentially equivalent or identical to petroleum-developed jet fuel. So because of that, we can conclude that the new alternative jet fuels meet the existing operating limitations for Jet A and Jet A1, so they can be used without any regulatory approval. So the ASTM process, in effect, is a process to show that the new fuel, the new alternative jet fuel, is the same as the existing fuel. It's the same fuel, it's not a different fuel. And what that means is that the ASTM specification, having the alternative jet fuel added to an ASTM specification, equals approval to fly. So I'm going to go through this chart quickly. We started all this back in 2006 with CAFE, the Commercial Aviation Alternative Fuel Initiative. You should go see that website. We have a ton of information on what's going on with alternative jet fuels and sustainable aviation fuels. And we issued the drop-in fuel spec in 2009. The first annex was included with that spec. That's Annex A1, and that was Fischer-Tropsch. Our evaluation process or qualification process, D4054, was issued the same year, 2009. And since that time, we've progressively added additional annexes to the drop-in fuel spec to D7566. And so there's been, as you can see, a regular progression. Annex A5 was initially approved just with isobutanol as a feedstock for alcohol to jet. 2 years later, we added ethanol as a feedstock. And more recently, just this past December, we added CHJ, catalytic hydrothermolysis jet, as Annex A6. And then we added a version of HEFA that includes hydrocarbons along with triglycerides or lipids as part of the feedstock. That was Annex A7, that was added in May. So again, you can see a regular progression over the last 14 years, and when we get later in the presentation, I'll show you, hopefully we can keep this going. The first process improvement I'm going to talk about is the clearinghouse. Effectively, this is one-stop shopping. That's the idea. When we started evaluating these fuels at ASTM, the new fuel producer was forced with running around ASTM meetings, grabbing as many people they could and asking how to test things, where to test things. So we tried to consolidate everything under FAA funding in this clearinghouse. And so the idea is that a candidate alternative jet fuel producer would provide a fuel, a certain amount of fuel, 100 gallons is what we look for initially, to the clearinghouse. Clearinghouse would do all the work in terms of coordinating the testing, funding a lot of it, not necessarily all of it. And after all the testing is done and coordinate the reviews with the OEMs and the FAA, when all that's done, a research report would come out that's ready for ASTM balloting. So the clearinghouse is run out of the University of Dayton Research Institute, UDRI. Zabarnik is the guy you should contact if you want to get information how to get started on the process. The FAA is funding it under a Center of Excellence program we have called Ascent. That means we fund 50% of all the activity, and so it's under a cost share. And that means industry has to fund the other 50%. But because it costs so much to develop these fuels, the cost, meeting the cost share typically isn't a challenge. So ideally, other entities, if they have a real interest in improving these alternative jet fuels, for example, to meet carbon emission goals, could contribute to the clearinghouse to help facilitate the evaluation and approval of these fuels. That's the icon, is the little house with the CH in it, so keep your eye on it. I'll use it later on. D4054 Fast Track is basically an accelerated program, a light testing program, that under certain circumstances we allow fuels to go through. It's a light testing program. It's pretty much fuel property testing along with in-depth fuel compositional analysis is primarily the only things we require under the fast track. And you only go through one review process with the OEMs. It's not two phases, it's only one. However, in order to be able to use the fast track, two conditions have to be met. First of all, it's only for alternative jet fuels with hydrocarbon compositions that look very much like a conventional jet fuel. What that means is you want a well-distributed hydrocarbon distribution between C8 and C16, and we have other target values in the fast track annex in D4054, telling or indicating or illustrating what we're looking for and what we consider a conventional, something that looks very much like a conventional jet fuel. The other way to look at it is that it's a much more narrowly defined alternative jet fuel, that we want it to be, not on the outlier of the properties or composition of conventional jet fuel. We want it dead center, right in the middle, very closely defined. And it's also, once, if and when a fuel is approved, it's only limited to a 10% blend percentage. Regardless of any physical property, regardless of the physical properties, you may be able to blend it to a higher percentage, but because we approved it under this light testing program, we're only limited to 10% blend concentration. And that's the icon for the fast track annex. The next process improvement initiative that we've just started introducing is called pre-screening. The D4054 process I just went over, and that bracket, we kind of lost something in translation here. That bracket should encompass the whole graphic on the bottom. It was intended for fuel producers, candidate fuel producers, who'd gone through the experimental phase and sort of locked in their conversion pathway and locked in what their composition is going to be, and they're ready to come to ASTM and they're ready to scale it up to maybe from pilot scale to maybe to pilot scale or to demo scale, and make enough fuel to support the ASTM evaluation. And we coordinate that through our CAFE cert quality team, which I lead. So again, it's a more mature candidate fuel when it's ready for D4054. So we looked at it and we thought, well, there needs to be some guidance to candidate fuel producers earlier in the process when they're dealing with lab scale experimentation, help them refine their catalyst, their conversion process to result in a final composition or a fuel with properties that's going to make it easier. It's going to be conducive to getting through the D4054 process. So this pre-screening concept evolved from the National Jet Fuel Combustion Program. It's coordinated by our CAFE R&D team. And the key is that very low volumes of fuels are required for the testing that consists of the pre-screening phase. It's done separately from ASTM. It's done typically, and it's already started. There's several companies taking advantage of this, but it's done under a more proprietary type environment where, it's done. The University of Dayton, Josh Hain at the University of Dayton is sort of leading this effort. He helps coordinate the testing, but the idea is it's very closely held between the fuel producer and the people who are doing the testing. And as I said, the idea is to help the fuel producer to optimize or refine their conversion process before spending a lot more resources on producing more fuel and going through the ASTM process. And that's the icon for the process improvement. National Jet Fuel Combustion Program was started back in 2014 or 2015. The idea was to study the impact that different fuel compositions have on combustor operability. And the reason for that was, as you can see in the graphic, Tier 3 and Tier 4 testing, where you might go through combustor rig testing and/or engine testing, maybe even flight testing, you're spending a lot of money making a lot of fuel to support that. So if there is a shift in the composition of the alternative jet fuel from what we consider a very typical petroleum-derived jet fuel, conventional jet fuel, the OEMs are going to want to see testing on, as I said, combustor rigs and engines to make sure there's nothing unusual relative to combustor operability. Under the National Jet Fuel Combustion Program, a referee rig was developed, requires less fuel, combined with a few other testing, shock tube and spray rig. The idea is that you can spend less money, use less fuel, and verify that there are no concerns with combustor operability. So we're trying this out with one company right now is going through D4054. They're also going to conduct some of the National Jet Fuel Combustion Program tests, the referee testing and other testing. And just one other comment on this. The OEMs have been very closely involved in that, and they're very interested in general in the relationship between fuel compositional shifts and impact on combustor operability. And there it is. There's the icon for the National Jet Fuel Combustion Program. And getting to the final slide, here's the status. So the process, the D4054 process in this chart starts on the left side, goes to the middle, then jumps up to the top, goes across to the right side of the slide, and then drops down to the final ASTM balloting and issuance of annexes in T7566. So what we're going to do with this status is we're going to work backwards. Here are the 7 annexes that have been approved and have gone through this whole entire process. Right now, Virent synthesized aromatic kerosene, it's a purely aromatic stream, has been, it's gone through phase 1, it's done some tier 3 and tier 4 testing. The data is being put into another report. Virent went through some corporate reorganizations where it's now been purchased by another company again, so they're going through some corporate reorganization. So there's been couple of reasons why things have slowed down, along with the pandemic, which pretty much slowed everything down. But they're still considered active with SAK. Green diesel, which we're calling HFP HEFA, high freeze point HEFA, and Shell IH squared, they have produced research reports and discussion, and with Shell, the OEMs are currently reviewing that research report. We decided to give the OEMs more time to review it because of the pandemic. That was very nice of us, and the OEMs were very appreciative. But they're currently reviewing HFP HEFA. There's ongoing discussions that have continued regarding the phase 1 research report that's been going on for a while. So the companies involved in that, and ST and Boeing actually, are working with the other OEMs to perhaps going again. Other fuels, Swedish Biofuels is working on a version of alcohol to jet with aromatics. The currently approved alcohol to jet is purely paraffinic, and they're in the final stages of putting their research report together. Global Bioenergies, another European company along with Swedish Biofuels, is working on doing tier 1 and tier 2 testing now for their fuel, which is similar to alcohol to jet, and also similar to Amyris SIP fuel, Annex A3. So there'll be some questions about where do we fit this fuel, but they still need to go through tier 1 and tier 2 testing, review with the OEMs, and then we start sort of thinking about, well, where will it fit in D7566. There are several fuels that we're having ongoing exploratory discussions.
Mark, just interrupting, you're in danger of going on way past your allotted time. So can you wrap up a little bit quickly? Thanks.
Last slide, I'm almost done.
All right.
Sorry. So the exploratory fuels and Vertimass is almost ready to do tier 1 in testing. And so you'll see the icons on the process improvements. We're actually implementing those with the companies that are working on testing. Where you see several companies taking advantage of the clearinghouse. IHI took advantage of Fast Track. And newer companies will take advantage of pre-screening. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry it took a little longer than it should have. Hopefully the beeping didn't drive anybody crazy. Let me know if it did. Thanks. Thank you very much. And I'll take any questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mark. That dinging was, I thought you might have put the presentation together while you were staying in a Buddhist temple in Thailand or something. It was just the sort of thing you hear there. But there are a couple of questions, but I think because we've gone over a bit, if you could look at them, Mark, and reply to them on the chat thing, then everybody can see your response. I think just in the interest of time, that's probably the best way to handle those, if you don't mind. Yeah. So we're going to continue with, away from the detail of what's getting approved and what isn't, onto what's actually happening out there at airports and all the rest of it, and projects around the world. And we've got Robert Boyd, who is right up to speed with this from IATA. And off you go, Robert. Great to have you.
Thanks very much, Mike. And it's always good to be here, part of this meeting. So thank you again. I'll treat this in sort of two halves, where I want to give a bit of perspective from the industry and what's happening regarding COVID. Because it's easy to sort of think, well, does that have implications on the drive for sustainability? But I'll do that pretty quickly, and then I want to switch into just taking a quick look at three policies, and I want to be as frank as I possibly can, and give you the best info I can about what's really happening from the industry side and what how we're thinking, and some of the discussions that we're really having live at the moment. So next slide, please. So this chart speaks for itself. I don't really have to say anything. It's grim. If you look back, if anyone was working in aviation or financial markets in 2009, you'll remember that. That wasn't a great time. But the 2020 cliff there, I think. So we know that it's not good. Next slide. And perhaps what's interesting to think about is, well, what does the recovery look like? And this does have some policy implications, which is partly why I show this. And different to some previous shocks, I suppose, that the industry has had, where often we see more of a aggressive V recovery. We're thinking this is more 2024, 2025 before we even return to the sort of levels that we were at. So we're talking a structural hit to our industry. Again, I know for many of you, I'm stating the obvious, but I mean, one of the numbers that hits me hard is when we look at the losses that the industry is racking up here, and in nominal terms over the next 2 years, so this year and next year, in terms of our forecasts, we're estimating that half of all the nominal profits since World War II, that's in excess of $100 billion. So I guess when we use nominal numbers, yes, there's a bit of an accounting trick there, but they're big numbers indeed. But next slide, please. So that's the doom and gloom out of the way. Really what I wanted to, the message here is just to say the IATA is governed by the CEOs, the board of the small group of that make the strategic decisions there. And one of the first things they came together and decided was a declaration. And if you see the one I've highlighted in yellow, I'm very pleased to say that that was substantial enough to make it into the declaration, and it speaks for itself there that aviation basically won't turn its back on its environmental targets. COVID could have been an easy excuse to do so, but I can say with absolute frankness that is simply not happening in the industry despite the challenges. So next, please. So the question you're really thinking, well, is SAF was gathering momentum, we might say. This economic hit is unhelpful when companies are looking to strike off takes and do these sorts of things. So what's SAF look like beyond COVID? And there's a few questions, obvious questions I've raised there. So we might jump straight to the next slide. So we look at all sorts of things, and this is not exclusive, but I mean, this is, no one I don't think has seen this. This is information we just released in our advisory council meeting only a day or two ago. So it's looking at some of the environmental perceptions of what the travelling public think, and it doesn't actually surprise me, but it still remains one of the top issues for travellers, that airlines focusing on their CO2 emissions is a significant thing on people's minds. So that's interesting information to continue to get and important. So next slide. It's not just consumers. I think we're all aware that governments have this top of mind as well, and often this is a whole of economy sort of discussion around when a particular government may be targeting net zero. Net zero has sort of become the buzzword. Aviation doesn't have that net zero goal, but we're increasingly being brought into these political discussions around net zero. Even China a couple of weeks ago came and started talking 2060, net zero. That's just sort of a change of stance for them. But I think in the 2050 columns there's a lot of European countries, which is, I think, no surprise to anyone, and of course the UK. I know this is very topical in the UK. So next, please. And this really isn't the reason why we take action as the industry, but the media is clearly, reporting on this every day. I mean, this is honestly was just one day of headlines I decided to grab and throw into a slide a few weeks back, but this is a daily thing. So next. I'm not going to, I think you all know this. We've had 3 goals for 11 years, so hopefully you've seen this slide regularly. Just to refresh, so the middle one is Corsia, basically, and the one on the right-hand side is our long-term emissions reduction commitment, so halving net CO2 by 2050 relative to 2005. So if we jump to the next one, and so schematically, I think you've all seen this as well multiple times. You might dream about it. I do sometimes. I've seen it that many times, but it's the Corsia bit's pretty easy to visualise there. That's the little hemisphere, and I'll reference that in just a minute. But the longer term, as that chart moves out, we ideally want to follow that dotted line down towards 2050, where there's half a gigaton of CO2 are actually down to 325 million tonnes. But of course, without any action, the line continues to follow that heavy blue line. So increasingly, there's been relevance and importance to understand how do we achieve that that big gap that exists there between where the heavy blue line's going and where the dotted line needs to go. So next, please. Okay, so I'm not going to talk through Corsia, although I just want to reference one thing which might have crossed your desk or be on your mind. It is in yellow. So why did the baseline change? It did change if you weren't aware. So what happened, there was a political decision in June, agreed by the ICAO Council, to change the Corsia baseline. So we always talked about carbon neutral growth 2020. So you can now say that's actually carbon neutral growth 2019. So there's a decision to change how the baseline was to be calculated. The baseline should have been calculated as an average of the industry emissions 2019 and 2020. I mean, we can all see, you go think back to my first slide, using 2020 is a complete black swan event in terms of the emissions from the industry. It would have meant that using that average would have taken it back to being something like carbon neutral growth 2012 or 2013. So those, the environmentalists may have celebrated that, and of course, the industry doesn't shy away from additional ambition. But I just would highlight that these agreements struck at the international level, in the ICAO world, are political agreements. It's difficult to get these agreements at a whole of world level. And if you go and tinker with it to this degree, these things can become very fragile. So that's really the reason why we're now carbon neutral growth 2019. So next, please. So this is just the history. I think you know where we're at. We've gone from really not knowing a lot about this topic, or having to develop, the images that Mark was just showing around. How do we know that this fuel's safe? That was the biggest thing to start with, and this is an ongoing process. But really, if we flow through to today and where I've written tomorrow, it's all about thinking about how do we scale this up? How do we make this into business as usual and much more significant part of our day-to-day fuel mix. So next. And again, on the stats, I just throw that in there as a refresh for people. You've perhaps seen this one, but there's plenty of flights. We know how to do this. There aren't those questions about feedstock or technical compliance. We can do it. Fuel produced today is impressive. It's come from nothing to something very quickly, but there's still a very long way to go to start to get these significant CO2 reductions. But we have had many airlines, either using this in a demonstration sense or early stage sense, or even committing to offtake agreements, which is helping some of these facilities get the capital to develop. So then, so next, please. So really, I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about some of the policy issues that's going on. So Waypoint 2050 is, that's been an industry-wide piece of analysis where we have sought to more granularly understand what could the different scenarios look like to go from where we are today to actually achieving our 2050 target. And by looking at it in a more granular sense, really looking at the contribution from each sort of pillar of improvement that we have available to us. I'll then just give you a brief insight on what's happening, or what the airline view is on the Green Deal, which is Refuel EU, and then on the long-term aspirational goal discussions happening in ICAO. So next. Yeah, so Waypoint, so just a reminder with ATAG, so you can see the little ATAG logo there, that just means it's all of industry. So it's not just IATA, which is one part of ATAG, but we're talking the OEMs, ACI, etc. So it really is, it's good when we bring the entire industry together in these sorts of exercises. But yeah, as I said, the key was to take a thorough look, a careful look with the right experts at, well, what contribution can technology play, or what would the ranges be? How much more can there be from operations and infrastructure, and what would those various ranges potentially be? But then particularly getting a sense of orders of magnitude, I suppose, of SAF and how much we would need. And most of the SAF has not been in a pure forecasting sense. It's more been in a backcasting. So looking at the other pillars that we have available to make the best predictions on CO2 reduction achievement, but then look at, well, what would be needed from SAF to get to where we need to go. And then if there's still gaps, if you're going beyond the technical limitation of SAF from either a feedstock or an approvals point of view, then can offsets play a role as well? So next. And briefly, a bit of I think this is the methodology, but more or less really what I just described. So looking at, sequentially traffic forecasting, then you've got your fuel burn estimates, then you're looking at what are the different improvements available, and then, as I say, looking at, well, what gap still needs to be made up from sustainable aviation fuels, and then finally, is there more from out of sector things such as offsets? So next. Yeah, just a bit of this is pretty high level, but this is, I think, the best we can do today, but schematic of the thinking. This is really the thinking around how we approach this. And I think you can see there that, when you get, five different options here from forecast, technology, operations, etc., and you get a range of scenarios within that from, what's happening today to, as you can see, aggressive CO2 reductions, aggressive SAF, etc. You get a whole range of different scenarios. So there is a more detailed report for those with the desire to dive into this. It's actually just been released. So we'll go to the next one. Really, I think this is what I want to show. So yeah, so this is distilling what's 100 pages into one slide, just for, I think, for the purpose of this group. But I mean, the three lines heading up into the sky are the more aggressive SAF scenarios. And if you see, on the y-axis there, you go across and you look at, well, what are those in actual quantities? You see around 300 million, 350, even up towards 450 billion litres. That's more fuel than we're actually using as an industry today. So hopefully that's magnitude of, the type of volumes that would be required if SAF is to play this large role in achieving these significant emissions reductions and on a pathway to the 2050 target. There on the lower ones, it's more of a current trend. So I think we're very early days in the development of SAF, but that was more an extrapolation of the current sort of the current trends that we're on. So it's an interesting question it's raised. It's how we either fill that difference between the current trends and where we would need to be. And then I suppose the big questions of policies that are going to be required to make that happen. So next. So yeah, very quickly, I'm sure many of you have heard about the Green Deal discussions, and they are in full force with the European Commission. I wanted to just briefly hone in on one element of Green Deal, which is being termed Refuel EU. And as I've written in the text there, it's as explicit as that. It says, consider legislative options to boost the production and uptake of sustainable alternative fuels for different transport modes. There's a specific focus on aviation here. That's been a shift in policy, I would say, from the Commission in recent years. They really understand aviation, in a sense, being a very hard to decarbonise sector and needing specific policy support. So there's a range of policies being put on the table. If we go to the next slide, you can see, where are we? There we go. So you can get a bit of a sense of the time. Oops, if we just go, if we just go back one to that timeline, you get a sense of the path that we're on here. So where are we? We're in the October to August, the August to October bit, which is public consultation. Cutting to the chase, one of the major policies being evaluated is a mandate. And my expectation is that is going to be an extremely serious policy consideration put forward by the Commission in December, as you can see there in the legislative proposal. And then that's going to become a discussion in Brussels from 2021. So next. The best intel I can give you from the airline's perspective is this has been a tricky topic for us traditionally to discuss mandates, because we all know in an international sector, if you introduce something that could create a price distortion, you can get a flowing on competitive distortion in our industry where one carrier that's exposed could be subject to higher fuel prices than a carrier that's not. That's created great challenges for us to even enter discussions on mandates. I can say that we've found a way to discuss this internally as IATA, as the entire industry, which is good. There's a couple of key elements though, that it must be an intra-EU system boundary on this policy. So we're talking about carriers outside of the European Union not being exposed to whatever policy package is put forward. I think one of the other key issues is there must be an appropriate time for the supply side to respond, and I think that's common sense. We've seen a few situations in the Nordics where there's sort of been the idea of a mandate developed very quickly, rushed through their legislative system, and almost switched on within 6 or 12 months. Some of you I think would know that. Norway, Sweden discussing this now, and also Finland has this on the agenda. But another key one for us to be, I guess, constructive at the table in these discussions is it must be a package of policies. And one important element is reopening the discussion around the multiplier. So currently it's at 1.2 times in the Renewable Energy Directive for SAF, but that needs to be higher, to put it very plainly. So next, please. And we just get to the next one, and that's the last one I'll mention. Okay, now this, I think everyone's perhaps got this on there, or at least heard this. ICAO is in the political discussion of talking about a long-term aspirational goal. So, I mean, to be clear, the industry has a long-term goal. I just referenced that. That's halving CO2 by 2050 relative to 2005. Governments don't for aviation. So ICAO has this firmly on its agenda for 2022. The CAPE is the Committee on Aviation Environment Protection. That's one of the ICAO bodies that does a lot of this technical work, and it's the Fuels Task Group that I'm heavily involved in and doing a lot of fuel production forecasts. That's feeding directly into these long-term goal scenario development. So what role can fuel actually play in a long-term goal? This is ultimately going to become political, though. This will become a political discussion in 2022. But I flag it here because it is not falling off the radar. It's actually going to be more and more on the radar, and I think more understood that governments are going to have to be thinking about this as they lead into the assembly. There's one other thing that's worth noting is there is required to be another, what ICAO call a Conference on Aviation Alternative Fuel. Now that has binding declarations that come out of it. So conference in the word of the UN is a serious word. But I know that there will be an objective to agree on a quantitative declaration for SAF coming out of that. So again, that's a politically sensitive one. And then on the far right, you've got all sorts of things from all these regional roadmaps. You've got things like the Jet Zero Council in the UK. I mean, the UK is at the forefront of some of these discussions. We've still got the industry targets. We've got Waypoint, and then there's the Clean Skies for Tomorrow work, which some of you might have been involved in. But that's, I believe, going to be released in the next week or two. Not completely dissimilar to some of the themes talked about in Waypoint 2050, but definitely adding fuel to the fire, and it'll be fed directly towards the European Commission as well as they think about the refuel policy package they determine. So just to the last slide, just to leave you with a bit of food for thought. I sometimes use this a bit from the advocacy standpoint when we're talking to the policymakers, which is really, we do need policy support. We want it to be for a finite period of time, though, where, under certain assumptions, we do believe that you can get to some competitiveness as we get into an increasing carbon cost environment. but also getting some economies of scale with starting to really accelerate the development of SAF. And I think it's feasible before 2040, and that's in a realistic sense. So I know I've given you a really quick overview of my thoughts there, but there's a lot more detail in some of these reports, which happy to share, offline, or answer a few questions now if you've got time.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. That's terrific overview, and it sort of can't help but feel it makes the technical problem seem relatively simple compared to the political one. But there is only one question, and I'm going to again ask if you could take it offline. You'll see it on the list at the side from Chris Lewis. But we're 5 minutes over time at the moment, and I don't get my bonus if we're late finishing. So I'm going to try and keep it on track. And we've got some really good presentations coming up, so I don't want to make life hard for them. We're going to move away from the world of SAF and into a more realistic, a more immediate problem, and that's the world of SAP. And we've got two presentations. First up is Amy Carrico, who is really up on this and comes from A4A, and is going to tell us all about what's going on. Okay, Amy, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks very much. Let's just get into this since we're a little bit behind. Next slide, please. So the reason that we're here, SAP is bad. So we've got this issue where we have superabsorbent polymer in existing filter monitor technology that has the capability, even under normal operating conditions, to go ahead and leave the filter. And when it does leave the filter and gets onto the aircraft, it could cause a potential issue in the aircraft or the engines. And so we've got to move away from this technology, even though we've been using it for a number of years. And so we've got this global effort to try to find drop-in replacement technologies that can suit our needs as an industry, and also get rid of this SAP issue. Next slide. So I just wanted to take a moment, although this is a presentation on some of the upcoming technologies or the hopefully future technologies, I did want to highlight the bulletins that have been put out by A4A and JIG with these sort of mitigating steps for continuing to use filter monitors in the interim. So there are a number of steps that need to be taken in order to reduce the risk as low as possible for that SAP to leave the filter. And so these are really critical steps that, even if you're not following the JIG or the 103 standard, need to be followed, and airlines need to be following up with their fuel providers to make sure that these steps are absolutely being followed. This is to improve safety here. Next slide. So I did just want to highlight, we have a little bit of data here. It's not from a large sample size, relatively speaking, but we had this 2007 study that was done under the umbrella of IATA, where we had only about 67 service engine fuel filters that were returned. They were tested for presence of SAP, and approximately 80% of those were found to have SAP. Most recently, again, a limited sample size here, but it was approximately 50 fuel filters were found. 2% were found to be positive for SAP. So what it does show, and these are obviously not absolute numbers because it's not a large sample size, but it does show us or give us some indication that the mitigating steps that I just highlighted on the previous slide are having some effect, and in terms of reducing the risk that we may have for an SAP migration event. But I still want to emphasize there in the green text, SAP is still bad. We still need to get rid of filter monitors, and that's not going to change. We're just maybe in a slightly better place than we were before, but we need to move forward without an SAP technology. Next slide. So getting into the new technology evaluation processes, it's kind of a lengthy process. You've seen this slide probably in a number of presentations that have been given recently on this topic. So we have this kind of research and development phase that the filter manufacturers undertake themselves. Then you would have a specification, which is done under the auspices of the Energy Institute. Once there's a specification written, and in theory, if the filter is proven, it would get a qualification. It would go into this field trial phase, which is being conducted jointly by A4A, IATA, and JIG on a global scale to see how do they work in the real world to be sure that we don't have any issues with these new technologies. And then there's a review phase where all the individual standards bodies take all that data that's been collected on these new technologies. They evaluate, is this suitable for their specific use specification, and then if it is, then it gets incorporated into those operating standards, and then we would have a use phase where users could actually start implementing those new technologies. Next slide. All right, so let's take a look here at some of the possible replacement technologies that are either here in the marketplace already or are coming to the marketplace, we hope, in the near term. So next slide. So the first one is a filter water separator. It's a tried and true technology, been around for almost forever, it feels like, already approved in every single operating standard that exists around the world. It's a known technology. We know how to use it. We know how it operates in the field. It now comes in a much smaller format. So we have a 2-inch format available now in these filter water separators, which means they can fit in a much smaller diameter, which makes it more adept to mobile technologies into plane applications. It's a technology that's operationally familiar. So users are familiar with how to use the technology. They understand how it works, what its limitations are, et cetera. And it does remove, both dirt and water, which is great. It does have a couple of limitations that we do manage in the field on a day-to-day. It can be disarmed by surfactants, but again, that's something that we're aware of and have been learning how to manage as the years have progressed. And in fact, the newest technologies for filter water separators are in fact quite good and robust. It does require, if you wanted to switch from a filter monitor to a filter water separator, it does require you to get a brand new filter vessel. So it would not fit into an existing filter monitor vessel. And even then, the vessel is slightly larger than a monitor vessel, so it may not fit on all refueling equipment, but it should fit on most refueling equipment. So this is a good option. It exists today. It's approved in the standards. Next slide. So the next technology that we have to potentially replace SAP filter monitors is the dirt defense filter with electronic water sensor system. And that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's important that we get both of those components together. It's a 2-component system. It has to have the dirt defense filter and this electronic water sensor in order to work as a full replacement for filter monitors. Without both components, it would not actually be a replacement for the monitor. So this is the first technology that was successfully field trialed. It went through a 12-month global field trial, had qualification and robustness from the EI before that, went through a lot of work to prove itself to the marketplace. It does come in that 2-inch format, so that means it could drop into existing filter monitor vessels. I would like to say it does also fit in 6, we have a 6-inch format as well. So, but I am focusing a little bit on the 2-inch formats here because that's where the biggest need is in terms of replacing filter monitors. So again, they fit into existing filter monitor vessels, which is great. You can just do a filter element change and drop them in. It's already included in most operating standards as of August of this year. Note, not all, but most of the operating standards have included this technology now. Based on the data that was collected during the global field trial, we believe that the technology, the filters themselves should last longer than you see with a filter water separator or with a filter monitor. So you're going to get a longer element life. You're not going to have to do as many element changes. You may have some potential cost savings on the filters themselves. And it is important to note that the technology, the filter itself removes dirt, as the name sort of implies, dirt defense filter. On the flip side, we know the technology is not going to be suitable for all operations because it does not remove water. So if you're in an operation that has some challenges with water, this technology is not going to be suitable because the water isn't removed, it's just sensed and the fueling shut down to be sure that that water doesn't get onto the aircraft. It's a little bit different operationally than things that we're used to with the electronics. So it's just going to take some time and some learning for users to implement the technology, but that's it's not a complicated technology. It's just something new that they'd have to learn. There is the potential, if the sensors are installed improperly, for it to not read, for it to read poorly. And this is a really critical piece that everyone who may be considering implementing this technology needs to be really aware of. The installation has to be done correctly for the sensor to be relied upon accurately for detecting that water. So it's really critical that you get that sensor installed properly. And the unknown right now for the industry is, is there, and this is kind of a question that a lot of people have asked, how much more water will be delivered to aircraft on a global basis? So I think it's important to note during the global field trial that was done, we didn't see any deliveries of fuel that were above 15 parts per million. But it really is only representative of those handful of airports that the technology was tested in. It doesn't necessarily mean that all airports across the world are dry, and that when you take this technology to a global scale, that you would see those low levels of water, but we could. We just really don't know because we typically haven't collected data on how much water is upstream of that into-plane filtration versus, you know, what's coming downstream to the aircraft. So that's a bit of an unknown, but we'll find out as we move forward with the technology and people start implementing it. Next slide. So the next technology is a water barrier filter. This filter also comes in that 2-inch format, so it could fit into existing filter vessels with filter monitors. It does remove both dirt and water. On the flip side, right now it's kind of unknown what the service life is going to be, especially in high throughput locations. It does seem from the preliminary data in some of the EI testing that this technology may be prone to higher differential pressure with ultrafine particulates. So we'll just have to see as that plays out whether or not the service life is going to be what we expect it to be. Really also important to note, it has not been successfully field trialed yet. So it's really still in the preliminary phases of that field trial and has got a ways to go before it could potentially be considered for inclusion in any specifications. So that leads to my next bulletin. It's not currently in any operating standards. So currently, you know, there's no allowance for using this technology in any of the operating environments out there. The other thing is it's not operationally familiar, right? So this technology has a little bit of a different behavior with the differential pressure than typical and traditional filters that we've seen before. So that is also going to take a little bit of a learning curve. Again, not very complicated, but it is just something that users will have to make themselves familiar with in order to use the technology going forward. Next slide. So the last technology right now that we're going to talk about, and this is the water containment filter. This technology hopefully will come in a 2-inch format, so may fit into existing filter vessels. The technology may remove dirt and water, and I want to emphasize the may in all this because you see there on the right side, there is no EI specification for this technology yet, which is kind of the first step in that process in order to get a new filter included into the operating standards. So this technology, if it ever makes it, really has a long way to go, and it's unclear at this point if it's ever going to get there. But this is another technology that's in sort of advanced development at the moment and in discussion with the EI about potentially writing a specification. Next slide. There are some other technologies out there that are in development, but we don't really have a lot of details on those technologies. So hopefully, for the sake of the industry, we will see more technologies continue to be developed as replacements for these filter monitors. Next slide. So I did want to address, you know, at the end of this year, on 31st December, the EI will withdraw the 1583 specification. So that means that the specification for today's filter monitors will no longer be valid. But I think it's really important to distinguish that although the specification is going away, the existing qualifications for those 7th edition filter monitor elements would remain valid even after the EI withdraws the specification, as long as no changes are made to the filter design and materials, construction, et cetera. So the qualifications for the filter monitors will remain valid after the end of this year, even though the specification will be withdrawn. Next slide. I wanted to just highlight that at the end of last year, both A4A and JIG came out with some bulletins highlighting that for an interim period of time, and I want to stress interim, although the EI specification is going to be withdrawn, both of those operating standards are going to continue to list filter monitors as an acceptable into-plane filtration technology as we continue to evaluate those alternatives that I just spoke of. Next slide. But I think it's really important to note that this is really just an interim decision based on where we're at today. With COVID-19, the projected start and end dates for a lot of these technologies has really slipped. Border closures, shipping delays, all sorts of things like that. The inability to travel has really made it difficult to get a lot of this technology moved forward as quickly as we would have hoped we could have by now. And so because of all this, I highlighted that in red, and these are excerpts from that joint notice that came out earlier this year. The original proposed roadmap for phasing out of SAP filter monitors can no longer be met. And I know it's a lot of text on the slide. It's right there in the bulletin, so you guys can go and look at it and find out, all the specifics, because there is a lot more detail in this notification other than the parts that I put on the slide. But I did want to highlight that last bit there at the very bottom. There is no future for filter monitors in commercial aviation, full stop. We are going to continue to march forward with the evaluations of these new technologies. And as I outlined previously, there's already 2 technologies that are currently listed in the operating standards today that can be used that do not have SAP. And so as we continue to evaluate more and more drop-in technologies, filter monitors will go away, and there won't be any filter monitors in use in the coming years. Okay, that's it for me.
Okay, thanks very much, Amy. Great summary, and it's obviously a pretty difficult area from the technology perspective. You can't evaluate systems if there's no fuel going through them. Okay, there's no questions at the moment on the thing, but we won't take any questions for the minute because we're going to follow on with a presentation from Rob Midgley from Shell Aviation, who's going to talk about how you move away from filter monitors and the work that he's been involved with in that process. So over to you. And just to note that I think inevitably we're going to be finishing about 10 minutes late. So sorry about that, but I think it's great to not to close things down too much and reduce time. So let's go on. Okay, over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Mike. This presentation that we've got for the next 10 minutes is somewhat different to Amy's in that we're going to start to look at what do you need to implement when you're moving away from filter monitors. So what's the process of change? The next slide, please. Disclaimer here, just saying this is our opinion. If you follow our advice, it's at your own risk. The next slide. The agenda that we got here is just looking at what the general decision principles are for moving away. Amy's mentioned a couple of different technologies there. We are putting a lot of effort in Shell to implementing the electronic water sensor and dirt defense filter. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll go through the process of the implementation and give you some idea of the timings and the time that's needed for these rollout phases. So next slide, please. So really, the first process is to decide what you're going to do to remove filter monitors. So as Amy said, filter monitors don't have any future in commercial aviation, and we need to be looking at the options to move away from them. A lot of people are looking at the work that's happening in the industry to try and improve new technologies that might drop in. But at this stage, we're left with only 2 approved alternatives: dirt defense and electronic water sensor, or a filter water separator. And as Amy's pointed out in her presentation, if you have a wet location, then it would be sensible to fit an EI 1581 filter water separator if you haven't done already. It's interesting to note that with filter monitors, if you have a wet system, they're not very practical in their own regard because they don't have very much capability of removing water at all. So we're anticipating that wet systems, if they're not moved over to 1581 already, would be moving over to 1581 type technology. Vast majority of places that we have in our system, we have fuel quality which is going into the filter, which is low enough water that we can fit dirt defense and electronic water sensor. So routinely we're supplying fuel which is very clean and dry. So next slide, please. So decision principles, we're looking for signs of water effectively. So have you got any historic filter monitor change outs that are earlier than the 12-month period? Just to give you an example of what does this mean, then an average 30-inch by 2-inch filter monitor element will extract something like 85 millilitres of water to go from minimum to maximum differential pressure. And so if you look at a fueling system, a high flow hydrant fueling system, say 3,000 litres a minute, 800 US gallons a minute, that would be 26 of those elements in a vessel. And the capacity of that vessel to extract water is around about 2¼ litres of water. That's all, 0.6 of a US gallon. So most filter vessels are going to 12 months without reaching maximum DP. So most filter being exposed to very much water is the conclusion of that. But that change out frequency of filter monitors is a good indication of whether you have an intrinsically wet system or not. So going through that process is useful. Also looking at the space you have on vehicles. Again, Amy mentioned that filter water separators are physically larger than filter monitors. So is it practical to be able to fit those vessels onto a vehicle, or do you have to be then looking for a change out solution that uses existing equipment and existing vessels? There are some cost-saving advantages to some of these technologies, especially when you start to look at the fact that you've got a longer filter life, you're not doing chemical water detectors under the wing, that sort of thing. So some locations we're seeing reduction in filtration costs by implementing new technology. So it's not just about removing SAP. If you plan it correctly and you're looking at the planning process and implementation process correctly, you can actually save money over time as well. So it's not just all about fixed capex; it's also the OPEX saving later. So next slide, please. This is the technology that was been mentioned with electronic water sensors. So we're fitting sensors in the field trials. Have been fitted upstream and downstream of the filter, which you can see on the right-hand side image. The process for implementation in the field is to fit the electronic water sensor downstream of the vessel. In Shell, we've also decided to put a bulk water sensor inside the vessel itself, and that's because at low flow rates, these filter elements have a capability of holding water on the dirty side of the filter instead of passing it directly through. So one of the hazards of that, or one of the concerns that might be associated with that, is the accumulation of water in the upstream side of the elements. So that can be drained from an operational viewpoint, that can be drained using procedures, but we're preferring to put a sensor in there as well so that we've got some early warning of that as well. So we're effectively installing two different sensors, a downstream part per million type sensor and a bulk water sensor in the vessel. Next slide. Interestingly, when you look at approvals from or the inclusion of equipment into standards, the standards bodies always say that it's up to the user to approve the equipment. So we've been quite diligent with that. We've done quite a lot of our own testing. A lot of this has been on lab testing. Well, it's been on flow rig tests, which is simulating the flow rates that you get in fueling. We're quite fortunate in Shell that we've got that type of capability, but we've looked at deliberately putting emulsified water in there, different flow velocities with different amounts of water, if that changes the water morphology, looking at bulk water, combinations of dirt and water to see if the sensor still accurately detects the water element rather than just being distracted by the dirt. And we've looked at different additive concentrations and the effect that they might have on water dispersions. So all of that's been successful. Next slide, please. We've also extended that into outside of the rig environment and into large-scale representative testing of equipment. Simulated hydrant work, where we've used emulsified and bulk water, again using a hydrant cart. And then with refuelers, we've looked at how might water get into a refueler once it's been filled, and that's through things like water ingress through manhole covers, the pump suction pipe work, and so we've effectively simulated that and demonstrated again that we detect that every time with the sensors. So we're pretty confident this stuff works. We've also done our own field trials, as well as the GIGA A4A and IATA sponsored field trials that have recently happened, and we've been successful with those as well. Incidentally, those field trials are showing an average of water content going into the filter, not downstream of the filter, but going into the filter. The average water content is around about 2 parts per million with an interplane limit of 30. So most of the time, these filters are not doing. So just to sort of put a line in the sand of what the exposure is to these filters. Most locations, most of the time, the filter is actually not doing anything. So next slide, please. So what's the implementation process look like? Well, we've broken this down into 3 phases in Shell. Phase 1 is installing the sensors themselves. Phase 2 is then operating those sensors with existing filter monitors. And then the final phase is changing the element type to dirt defense. So we're operating with dirt defense plus the sensor. And we're doing that because it's a learning process. As Amy said, there's some slight changes in the practical approach to how you operate these systems. So we're introducing these in stages, and that helps the process of both the documentation and management of change process, but also the familiarity with the equipment whilst you're using this next stage, this second stage implementation. So next slide, please. This is the equipment that goes in there. So there's essentially a control box. There's that you can see the blue AFGuard sensor in there. We've got the bulk water sensor. There's connection through to the pump or the valve, and we've got this indicator light as well. So relatively simple in terms of the equipment that needs to be installed on the vehicle, and relatively small footprint as well. So next slide. So what do we need to do? Phase 1 installation. Well, we need to decide that we're going to fit these sensors. And I think, for those of you that have not started engaging with this program of conversion yet, then I strongly encourage you to at least start to plan this. So you need to be planning the CapEx part of that, how much it's going to cost, identify the certified installers. As Amy said, positioning of the sensors is important. So who is certified to do that? And if that's not possible, then what training is needed for staff to be able to fit these sensors and the adapters for the sensors into the pipework. Typically, it takes about 3 to 4 days per vehicle. So planning that rotation of those vehicles out so that you're not embarrassed by a lack of vehicles at a location. Of course, COVID is helping us with that at the moment because we don't have much demand for fuel. So it's actually helping us through this conversion process. Having a project plan around this, where what's the staging in which country, in which locations that the conversion process is going to happen, what's the transition around that, and then how do we implement that change. So next slide, please. So this first slide is really all about the planning and installation process. The second is then turning the operations on. So turning the sensor on, but with existing filtration equipment. And that then starts to require lots of changes to the standards and training that you're operating to. So changing your operating manual, the maintenance manual that you use to maintain equipment. You need to change training procedures for staff. The operating procedures on the airport need to change for these fueling staff. And we also need to update the compliance checklist. So when inspectors go to look at the equipment, they know what they're looking at and they know what they're checking for. We also need to then start to look at the electronic water system sensors compliance. So what's the checking process of that? What's the oversight program for making sure that that's continuing to work and is calibrated? And then there's a management to change process that sits behind this, which then translates from using, in our case, chemical water detectors on fuelings to using the sensor on fueling. So what are the issues that might be associated with that change process? And do we then want to have a process where we're doing both at the same time? So we've got operators getting used to the new system whilst they're not exposing the aircraft to risk. That type of process of MOC. Eventually, we'll then remove the chemical water detectors from the standard operating procedure, and we go into a live scenario with the sensors. So next slide. Final stage is just simply swapping the elements out. So we're changing then from when we've got used to the operational practice, we're changing from filter monitors out to dirt defense filters. So relatively straightforward. It's then changing, there's an information piece that needs to go out to the users. We've actually been communicating quite aggressively, but quite freely with our customers on what we're doing here, so that they're not surprised when they turn up and find that we're fueling with dirt defense plus sensors. And that's really because we're sort of on the leading edge of this change process. So it might be the first time that airlines have arrived and seen this type of technology. So that communication piece is really important. And there's some practical things like changing the data plates on the element vessels and such. There's the test procedures that are in place. There's testing on site using a loop tester to test the equipment response for the sensor. Every 24 months, the sensor gets sent away for recalibration. And on the slug guard, the bulk water sensor, there's a practical on-site 3-monthly test. So incorporating that into the maintenance program for the sites as well. So next slide. What does that look like in terms of timing? Well, our timing for this all started for us late last year, so Q3 last year, and we're intending to be operating without filter monitors come the end of this year. So it's something like a 12 to 15 month program for our size of operation. So you can get some idea of what sort of timescales you need to be looking at for yourselves. But I'd encourage everybody to be starting to consider what they might do in that phase 1 part, where they're looking at the equipment changes that might be needed. And our view of this is that we're not necessarily wedded to this technology forever, but if we've got sensors on the vehicles, then as and when other types of technologies come into play, they either might or might not need that sensor. And if they don't need the sensor, we remove it. So we are ready for any type of technology change at that point. The next slide, please. That's all I had. It's effectively just looking at the operational process of then changing filter elements out, and I'll take questions either now or Mike maybe at the end, I don't know.
Yeah, fantastic, Rob. Very comprehensive, and it's a lot of attention to detail in terms of implementing that process. In fact, I'm thinking from a UK perspective, it's a shame they didn't put you in charge of the UK test and trace system, which is by comparison running like a fiasco. Anyway, I don't see any questions being thrown in, so I think that's is just is in a way great, because we're going to move on, and if anybody's got anything at the end, but we're trying to just plow on a bit. The next session, the next thing is all about test methods, and we're lucky to have Kevin Bauer from AirBP, who is the resident expert on test methods. And over to you, Kevin, to give us a great summary. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Mike. This presentation is on behalf of the Energy Institute, and I'm representing the test method standardization group that I sit on for this presentation. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at ASTM equivalents, and then we're going to go through some of the work that's going on in some of the different methods in terms of FAME, aromatics, thermal stability, viscosity, conductivity, freeze points, flashpoint, which has been mentioned before, particle counting, and some microbiological testing updates as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of, there's an ongoing work with ASTM to ensure that critical methods remain jointed. There are 14 joint EI-ASTM aviation test methods. So there's regular dialogue that goes on between the Energy Institute and ASTM in making sure that these methods remain equivalent. They're critical for the use in international trade and specifications. And within the EI, we have a steering group established to have oversight of the joint test methods. And we have a definition of the technical equivalents used to undertake the reviews, which is also then used by ASTM as well. Reviews are shared with the ASTM, and regular meetings are held between EI and ASTM staff. And we've recently established an MOU for establishing a joint method, how joint methods are managed. So there's been a lot of work in this activity in the last 12 to 18 months. Next slide, please. So we're still working on some of the FAME methods, the referee method, IP585. We're still working to expand the scope to allow higher levels and encompass low carbon methyl esters. This work has not gone as quickly as we would have liked, but we're still trying to. We're now in the process that we've rechecked some of the samples that we used in the original ILS, and they've found to be stable. And we're planning to have an ILS planned, which is awaiting. Well, probably run now into 2021 when we can move samples around a lot easier, and labs will have the capability to do the testing, because a lot of the labs are working on reduced resources at the moment. Next slide, please. In terms of the other FAME, the Hplc method, the precision with the higher scope, 3 to 140 milligrams per kilogram, is not as good as the previous ILS due to this extended range. So the method is being split into two parts: Part A for low level for refineries, and Part B for extended range. Unfortunately, the low carbon methyl esters cannot be detected by the HPLC, and that's detailed in the scope. Next slide, please. Yep. Aromatics has been there's a number, as George said, there's a lot of work going on in ASTM about introducing new methods for measuring aromatics. This is the first sort of first method that was developed after the FIA. This is the Aromatics by Hplc, the jointed method IP 4366379. So there was a ILS completed, a research report, and method revised to increase the scope to cover the determination of naphthalenes. There's improved precision for total aromatics, and now there is a precision established for naphthalenes that's close to D1840. The ACM method is subject to a ballot to ensure equivalence and update precision garnered, and address the negative votes that were received, and hopefully this will be finally resolved within Q4 2020. Once that's completed, then there'll be proposal to potentially use IP 436 and D6379 to measure naphthalenes as well. That was done. That proposal was made a few years ago, but they received a number of negatives, and we'll move that forward again as hopefully in 2021. And there's work ongoing for a new method in terms of correlation with the IP 436 with the new supercritical fluid chromatography methods. Static dissipator. So one of the actions that came about was as one of the new static dissipator went through approval in ASTM was that there was a requirement for a method to measure that additive. The method that's detailed in the specifications at the moment couldn't be used for this method, but so initially there was going to be a separate method that was going to be developed for the new static dissipator. But this new method is now going to be able to measure all the static dissipators that are listed in the specification. The method is being validated at ASTM for equivalency, and there are some equivalent typographical errors in the. Sorry, this is the current method for the current standards that's been balloted. I say this IPPM-FB. This is for the Kerajet 811. This scope has been changed to include the new static dissipators, and is at the stage of balloting at the moment. And an ILS is being planned. So the aim would be to have one method potentially that could test for all static dissipators in jet fuel. Next slide. There's been discussion from George about what's going on in D3241. There's a lot of activity. I think we're on a third issue of 3241 this year. So IP323 has been updated to include interferometry, ellipsometer procedures, and tube rating and maintain equivalence. However, it still needs to be updated again after the major change to D3241, which removed the gear pump models from this method. So that is ongoing. That is one of the critical methods that we've got to make sure it remains equivalent between ASTM and IP. But there's a lot of work going on within D3241. Next slide, please. Kinematic viscosity, IP71 D45. This has been a long program. It's been going on for a number of years. There was a joint funded EILS on jet fuels completed. Study included all the different types of fuel, Jet A, Jet A1, the semi-synthetic blends, JP5s and TS1 fuels. The idea was to look at the manual method for minus 20. So the research report has been published, and the improved procedure and precision is being used to update both the IP and the ASTM method. So the ILS has been completed for the distillate fuels to update their precisions as well. Right. Again, conductivity, there's a lot of work gone on in terms of updating the ASTM D624. So IP274 has been updated to maintain equivalence with the latest version of D2624. But again, changes to both to D624 are ongoing. So the IP method will have to be updated. IP5998, which is the automatic smoke point method, has been updated to maintain equivalence to D3241. And gum content which is IP131, which is the gum content for light and middle distillate fuels, has been updated with new precision aligned with D381. Freezing point. activity's not been as great on this in terms of that, but we've maintained the equivalence between all the IP methods, both all the manual methods IP16 and IP435 and 529. And the water separation characteristics of jet fuel by small scale water separation. Method was originally produced in by ASTM as D8073, and now an IP equivalent IP method has been produced as well with the same precision. Flashpoint, yeah, there was a lot of work. The joint ILS that Tina mentioned was a big piece of work where, as part of the new precision for D56, there was a request to also develop or identify what the bias was between all the freeze point methods. So that was a good activity and has resulted in the specification change. So there's been a lot of work on that. But at the moment, IP170, which is actually an EN ISO method, able, it's been revised within ISO CEN and looking at the verification action in terms of how you would verify the performance of the equipment. ASD 56 has been balloted following necessary legal change and including the decision determined in the multi-method study that has been referenced before. So there's a number of documents within ISO being updated in terms of guidance for flashpoint testing. IP 523, which is a small scale, is again undergoing its ISO CEN revision with this method specifications. And there's an update on IP at 602, which is another small scale combustibility test. So a lot of activity in Flashpoint. Just to confirm that, just to re-emphasize the change in the particle counting requirements in DEFSTAN. This was the result of an EI study supported by the MoD, which compared automatic particle counting and gravimetric methods in 2018-2019. The IPA and Resolve were used to eliminate water. The results were combined with the industry work to support the proposal for particle counting as an alternative to gravimetric for possible inclusion, and now which has been implemented in issue 12. So we've seen a lot of timescales of how long things have taken to get done. There's some people who've been working on this for a long time. They'll be pleased to see that the limits are now actually embedded into DEFSTAN 91091, thanks to the study that the EI did a couple of years ago. And there's a new draft method for counting abrasive particles in diesel fuel. Next slide, please. The Microbiology Committee is working on an update to IP 613, which is the determination of the viable aerobic contaminant microbiological content of fuels and associated water. So the aim is to bring it in close alignment with ASTM D7978, which, while not a joint method, is the same test. Next slide, please. Thank you. And any questions?
Hey, well done, Kevin. That's really good. And I think just for everybody, it really indicates just how much work there's going on behind the scenes to underpin the spec. It's not a trivial matter to have that all sorted, and the devil in all those test methods
is in the detail. Yes,
in the detail, right? And not seeing any questions on test methods as far as I can see, so that's good because we are, as you can see, virtually on the button. But it's often the case that we keep the best to the last. I mean, certainly in big gigs and concerts, the big act is always put on last, and that's what people wait for before they go home. And I think this one's no different. So without any delay, sorry to be last, Zach, but Zach's going to talk about one of the items that Kevin mentioned there, the reference fluid to calibrate JEFTOP equipment. So over to you, Zach.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thanks to the committee organizers for inviting us to give a status update on the project to develop an ASTM D3241 reference fluid. Next slide, please. So since we're going over, a bit over here, I won't bore you with the details. Most of you should be familiar with the Astm D3241 as the standard test method for thermal oxidation stability in most aviation fuel specifications. There was some questions that arose a couple years ago with one of the cross checks, the ASTM cross checks. There was some significant variance being reported in the results, and the cause of this variance was unclear, which led the community to the conclusion that they'd like to develop a reference fluid for said specification. Next slide, please. Enter the Coordinating Research Council and the members there laid out a request to have develop a repeatable fluid that could be generated the world over and used by anyone to try to as a reference. The short answer here is that we're at the end of this program. We have submitted a draft final report to the technical panel, and it's being reviewed currently. We anticipate getting feedback back in about 2 weeks. We'll incorporate that feedback and then resubmit the completed final report to the steering committee at CRC. That'll take about a month. So I would anticipate a report available to the public by mid-December on this, which will give all of the gory details. So this is really just a bit of a teaser. But some of the objectives, of course, were to develop a reference fluid that could produce a consistent deposit thickness, as well as to produce a pretty ambitious differential pressure in the device. Next slide, please. So the project was broken up into 3 phases. The first phase was more exploratory, trying to see if we could achieve something remotely close. And I think we hit the mark pretty well. We investigated mixtures of organonitrogen and organosulfur compounds in a aliphatic solvent. Some of the results there on charts on the right. The top right chart shows some deposit profiles at different temperatures. The bottom right chart shows the differential pressure profiles that we achieved using the initial test fluid at 300 degrees Celsius. Went back to the technical committee. They suggested a lower operating temperature for the JFTOT simply because most of the operators in the field are used to a 260 or 275. So we went back and reformulated at 275 degrees C, and you can see in the bottom left chart there, that was the formulation that we came up with. So that went on to additional testing. Next slide, please. The second phase of testing was to take our candidate fluid and really try to prove out to see what other factors might influence the outcome. We wanted a nice, stable reference fluid. So we investigated a number of factors listed there. In the end, we did not identify any major concerns with the base solvent or the instigating nitrogen sulfur compounds. We also looked at an accelerated storage process where we tried to heat this up and simulate a year's worth of storage of the test fluid to see if there's any impact on the final results, and we did not note any of significance. Next slide, please. So that led us to the third and final phase, which was a preliminary interlaboratory study. We thankfully had a number of labs that volunteered to run some test fluids. So we generated actually 2 test fluids at UDRI, single batch of each. Fluid A was a higher concentration. This fluid, in the results and in the report, it will be shown that it consistently produced a failing deposit, regardless of how that deposit was being evaluated or which lab was evaluating it, and consistently produced a DP of greater than 1. The lower concentration fluid B, came out of a request from industry to actually have a fluid that produced deposit, but a non-failing deposit, so something below 85 nanometers. And you see in the bottom right chart there, there's a box and whisker plot. We believe we were able to do that to have a fluid that could produce somewhere between about 30 to 80 nanometers of deposit pretty consistently. But the full data set is or will be available in the final report I think hope there'll be lots of interest about using this data potentially to assess precision for D3241 itself. Next slide, please. So really, there's the whirlwind tour of just letting everyone know that the final report has been submitted. We were, I believe, successfully able to develop a reference fluid for D3241 using some real fuel chemistry. Organonitrogen and organosulfur compounds were the instigating compounds. We've got some recommendations for a high and low depositing fluid to be run at 275 C. We were able to meet the original DP target with a fluid while operating the JFTOT at 300 C. I think if users wish to operate the JFTOT at a lower temperature, say 275, then I think we'll have to maybe look at perhaps a lower DP as being acceptable there. But that's up to industry to decide what they wish to do there. And generated lots of data with the pre-ILS. Quite pleased with it, and actually really looking forward to getting this report out into everyone's hands so that they can decide for themselves. But next slide. And just lots of people to thank. So AFRL for use of facilities, Halterman Solutions for some very useful discussions, and the various laboratories that contributed, as well as the project panel members and the CRC for funding this. So thank you very much.
Okay, Zach, some great work at Dayton there. Thanks very much. I'm actually not seeing any questions for you, and given that it's a little bit over time, it may be best to just leave it at that. And if anybody wants to follow up, all the questions will be circulated and in a document and answered. So that's pretty good. If you feel cheated that you didn't get your question answered. But thanks very much to everyone. Apologies for running slightly over time, but Zach really pulled us back there. So well done, Zach. I thought it went well overall, but please let us know, either writing into Francesca or Tina. Let us know how you think it went. It's the first time we've done it, so it's not going to be perfect, I guess. But let's hope we don't have to do it again. It would be my view. It's good fun, and obviously is more inclusive because people don't have to travel. But I think it's a great community, and it would be really nice to be able to meet up. Just think, if this was a proper face-to-face meeting and this was the end of the first day, we would all be trooping into the side room where Martin Honeybun would have organised some drinks and canapes for us. So instead, we've just got to go round to his house, and I'll be putting his address up in a moment if anybody's in London who wants to pop in to see him. Okay, so that's about it. Thank you very much, Francesca, for all the training and briefing and clarification of how this works, and to Tina and Katie in the background for putting the program together to make it happen. I think that's about it. Francesca, have you got anything else to say? Nope. Maybe not. All right. Well, all I can say is thanks very much for everybody, and look forward to seeing you face to face at some point. But you never know, we might have to do this again. Who knows? But if we do, see you next year. Bye.
Thank you, Mike, for hosting as well.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Okay, bye everybody. That's time.
Thank you, Mike.
Time to go.
Cheers.
Yeah. Cheers, guys.